From Geppetto Studios in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, welcome to the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast, your home for inclusive, positive geek culture, where we talk about movies, comics, music, books, and whatever else we feel like. Please welcome your host.
I'm going to go on a real long trip, but you come with me.
Brad Mendenhall.
Hey kids, it is episode 246 of the Cosmic Geppetto Podcast. Very excited to welcome Dr. Anna Peppard back to the show. Doc and I discussed the new Space Jam film and other athletes and entertainment. I believe it is the first time I've mentioned Shaquille O'Neal's Kazam on this program. Anywho, you may be wondering what my thoughts are on Marvel's Eternals. I'm a Marvel fan. This show started as a Marvel movie podcast. Well, I haven't seen it. Not so much a conscious decision, but I haven't taken the time to head to theaters. This is the first time I've waited this long to see a Marvel movie. I don't think this is the beginning of a trend. I'll definitely see Spider-Man No Way Home the weekend it comes out. I'm watching Hawkeye, and really like the first two episodes. But Eternals? I just can't get myself motivated to see it. Maybe when it comes out on Disney Plus and I see it there, I'll kick myself. I'll let you know. I think I'm probably a bad friend, and I'm probably a lousy podcast host because we have an amazing array of panelists. And we have published authors and doctors, literal doctors. And we bring them on, like my friend, Dr. Anna Peppard. Doc, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And what do I do with somebody with your credentials and your ability and your intelligence? You're on to talk about Space Jam, A New Legacy. There's definitely better stuff I could be doing with your skills. I sort of owe you an apology, but this is what we're going to do.
I am always happy for an opportunity to talk about LeBron James, so there is no apology necessary.
I like LeBron James quite a bit. He's very likable. He's very smart. He's an amazing athlete. And he has shown some pizzazz, but not in the way you would think. I really liked his work in what was the movie that he did?
Are you thinking of Trainwreck, maybe? The one with...
Yeah, Trainwreck. But Trainwreck was interesting because he was a doof in Trainwreck.
Mm-hmm.
It was a weird thing where it was this tall, world-famous, handsome athlete. He was like this sort of goofy, quirky girlfriend in the movie. He was sort of filling that role. It was a great, that's not what you expect. In Space Jam, A New Legacy, it sort of lessened his charm, and he was a bit of a stick in the mud.
I think that that's true. Like, I think that there's more charm in the Trainwreck performance because it plays against type, so there's like an inherent comedy there, and that works with kind of LeBron's inherent, I want to say inherent corniness, but I think it's actually like highly studied corniness, because this has kind of been his persona for a very long time, and this is someone who is incapable of existing outside of persona. And I don't mean that like as a criticism. Like, he's someone that's been in the media since he was a young teenager, so he has had to cultivate a persona just as a survival tactic. So, like, I'm not being critical when I say that. Like, I think he had to do that, and that is just part of how he manages in the world. But this movie definitely is just his persona as a movie. It is what it is. I mean, we can get into some of the kind of specifics and stuff and even sort of talk about experiences with the old one if you want, because I'm curious about whether you were a fan of that growing up or sort of what your relationship is with that as well.
A little background on me. Growing up, I was a huge Bugs Bunny fan. To the point where in my basement still is a handmade Bugs Bunny stuffed animal that my mom made for me. And
Aww.
Bugs was my best friend.
Aww.
Oh, gosh. She would look out. And we didn't live near other kids. My mom would tell the stories like, I would just look outside and there was little Bradley running around in the yard with his Bugs doll. And we were inseparable. I would wrestle it and play with it, and to the point where I wore it out. And it was falling apart, and my mom had to make a second Bugs, which is the one that's in my basement, made out of like corduroy material, so it could withstand too much love of a rambunctious child. The Bugs Bunny shorts actually age very well. When you're little, it's all about the big explosions and the taglines and, you know, the "What's up, Doc" and all that stuff. Then when you watch them again when you're maybe in your teens or your 20s, they're actually very smart, and the animation's beautiful and the music's amazing. When I was in college, that's when they did two Nike advertisements that I think they ran during the Super Bowl. That was Michael Jordan and Bugs Bunny, and that's sort of what inspired the idea. And they were great. They were amazing, and they were very quick, and they did a lot of the old jokes from those theatrical shorts. Like they're playing basketball against a couple of mean guys, and Bugs dresses in drag to distract him because he dresses up as a voluptuous woman, and the other players are whistling at him because he's so beautiful, and all those things. And I actually had a calendar in my college dorm room. Other people would have, you know, the Girls of Hooters or their Anna Nicole Smith count. Not me. I had Bugs Bunny and Michael Jordan dunking basketballs. And I've never been a huge basketball fan. It wasn't like a big Michael Jordan fan. It was just like, oh my God, I love those ads. And I love Bugs Bunny. So I had that. When they announced they were doing the movie, and it was going to be the director of those commercials, and that director, Peter Pitka, Joe Pitka, who also directed a movie called Let It Ride with Richard Dreyfuss. And I love that movie. It wasn't a successful movie or anything like that, but it was a really good movie. I was like, oh, wow, this could be really cool. And it wasn't. In the years since, people look on it with so much affection. But when the movie came out, people who watched it didn't like it. It wasn't a critically beloved movie. It made money, but if you slap Michael Jordan's face on anything, it was going to make money. And I think kids liked it. It was definitely more of a kids movie than I think I wanted it to be when I was in my 20s. You wanted to be the thing with those old Looney Tunes shorts where it's like, okay, it's a kids thing, but adults like it, and it didn't have that second layer. And Michael Jordan was a terrible actor.
Yeah.
He was a great commercial pitchman, but if you get too far out of a 30-second or minute-long ad, he was such a one-trick pony. I remember when they announced, it's like, oh, LeBron James doing Space Jam 2, everyone's excited. It's like, do you people remember Space Jam?
I think the thing about the original Space Jam, though, is that it exists, like, independent of the quality of the film. It was such a big deal back then to have Michael Jordan, like an NBA star, like the black star of the 90s, like, across media, right? Like, appearing in this movie. And I think that it's sort of, that's bigger than anything in a way, right? And I mean, all the merchandising around it and the ways that is bound up in Jordan's brand, the way that it's bound up in the mythology of Michael Jordan, which again is just bigger than so many other things, right? I mean, his quitting to play baseball is like part of the film, right? And integrated into the film. And like, I just think that there's certain elements of the original Space Jam that have taken on such a life of their own, like the opening credits sequence, like with the Quad City DJs song, like that is just such an iconic part of Michael Jordan's legacy and mythology that I can't kind of talk about Space Jam as a film so much as like, I guess I think about it as a product. Which, I mean, makes sense because that's what it is. But yeah, it's definitely not a good movie. And I actually didn't even see it when I was growing up, which is strange because I was super into basketball. Like, when I was a teenager, I was like playing basketball 4 hours a day. Like, my goal was to play professional basketball. And I was like gonna play in college and everything. And I made a big life switch and decided not to do that and like sort of go the academic road instead. But so I was, you know, I should have been the right age for Space Jam and everything. But it was like just like a kind of a couple of years like earlier before I really started getting into basketball. So strangely, I never watched it back then, and I only saw it for the first time like about 5 years ago. And yeah, I agree, I did not enjoy it. It is not good. And yet the excitement that I had with that opening credits montage, like in particular, like with the song, which I certainly heard the song a lot growing up, like playing basketball in the 90s and early 2000s, we played that song all the time. Like we would warm up to that song, we would like take the court to that song. It was just so much a part of the culture of basketball at that time. So it's really hard for me to talk about Space Jam like just as a movie, right? Because it's so integrated into a lot of different other aspects of culture and sort of takes on a life of its own because of that. I mean, you even just think about the way that kind of Looney Tunes imagery and stuff is sort of woven into the fabric of the NBA in terms of like products and tattoos and so many other things. And like doing the Space Jam dunk at like the dunk contest like a few years ago, right? It's sort of become so much bigger than what it is. And I don't think people go back and watch it and think about like it being a bad movie. I think it just exists in the cultural consciousness, kind of like almost independent of that, if that makes any sense.
Well, I wonder if it's a thing where you have great moments like that opening, the use of music, where it was a movie directed by a commercial and music video director.
Yeah.
Maybe putting together a full-length movie with a weak leading man and with perhaps not the most robust of concepts, that might be a bit much to ask. But if you need a scene with really great song and great imagery and like a compact section, is like, oh well, we can do that. That's what Pitka can do very well. Have you seen Pitka's comments about the new movie?
Oh, I have not. I'm curious.
He's not happy. And it's funny, it's the last movie he directed. He's still active and he still directs a lot of award-winning commercials. Like every year, if you watch the Super Bowl, you will see a Joe Pitka directed advertisement. And it's a lot of music stuff, a lot of sports stuff. I have the comment right here. Joe Pitka says, LeBron is an incredible athlete and a very good actor. Okay. But adds, quote, the truth is that LeBron ain't Michael. He says the film tied to plot to Michael Jordan's personal life, which was very true. In that first movie, he actually mentioned his father being murdered.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And his father played a role in early flashback scene at the beginning of the movie. Stated he feels Space Jam's far superiors. Supporting cast of Charles Barkley, Muggsy Malone, Sean Bradley. Sean Bradley. You remember Sean Bradley?
I do.
Grew up outside of Philadelphia. I was a Sixers, Phillies, Flyers, Eagles fan. Sean Bradley was a curse on Philadelphia. To the people who aren't familiar, Sean Bradley was 7 feet tall, looked like Richie Cunningham just caught in a taffy machine. I'm not belittling this, but he was a practicing Mormon. So I think it was like he played 1 year of college ball, then went on a 2-year Mormon missionary experience, which was part of his belief system. And I'm not downplaying that by any stretch of imagination. But basically, he only had 1 year of college ball and then 2 years off and then entered the NBA draft. And he was like, Sixers picked him at like number 2. With the thought process, like he was athletic and he had decent skills and that incredible size. So as long as he was like a mediocre talent with that size, he would be an all-star. He wasn't. He just was. He was a guy who had like a journeyman career, but not who you expect to be a number 2 draft pick. Michael Jordan was a number 2 draft pick, or 2 or 3. The Sixers invested a lot of money in him and were trying to make him the face of the organization, and he was just never that good. So it was just weird. You had Charles Barkley, Michael Jordan, Muggsy Bogues, some very good players, and then there's like Sean Bradley. One of these things is not like the other.
But imagine he'd be chosen for the comedy height value, but also presumably they wanted a white guy. I'm assuming is the thinking process there.
It takes a long time to film and cast and do a movie. It was probably a thing where they cast him when he was sort of a buzzy young player. And yeah, tall guy, looks different than the other people. And they even would do bits of him like walking into door frames and stuff like that. They had a really great cast of big deal NBA players, and heard a discussion about this. They had a tough time getting the same caliber of players because shoe contracts are really difficult to work around. So, LeBron's a Nike guy. And if you're looking at other big deal players, I think the other most famous player in the NBA right now would be Steph Curry. Steph Curry's an Under Armour guy. There's all sorts of weird contractual stuff with that.
I mean, it's funny though, because some of the stuff, I mean, people strongly associate LeBron with kind of what we have been calling the player empowerment era, linking back to something that is at least mentioned in the credit sequence of Space Jam: A New Legacy, which is the "I will take my talents to South Beach" thing, him looking out for himself and leaving Cleveland. But I mean, that is heavily associated with the player empowerment era, which is, players going where the money is, players sort of taking what they deserve, that kind of stuff. And I mean, if you support the player empowerment era, you think that those things are good, and I do support it. But at the same time, people sometimes don't understand the way that that's connected to things that Michael Jordan did. I mean, Michael Jordan was kind of the start of not the start of the player empowerment era, but certainly like a central figure in it. It's just, it took on sort of a different context in the 21st century. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm very interested in the relationship between the two films in terms of like what it means to be an NBA star like in 1996 versus 2001, and like what it means to be like specifically a Black male NBA star in 1996 versus 2001, because I think a lot of the things that people complain about with LeBron and kind of his persona and stuff, it's really an apples and oranges thing, because Jordan is just held up as such a godlike figure, and yet he was so protected by the media. Like, I mean, all of the negative things that could have been said about him were completely squashed by the media of that time. And that's just not the media context we exist in now. Like, every tiny little thing about LeBron is everywhere. He doesn't have that media protection. So that's why he's cultivated kind of this very staid, corny persona. It's related to that. And I mean, very, important to the story that we get in Space Jam is, the emphasis on Black fatherhood, right? Him really emphasizing himself as a positive father figure, which is a huge part of like LeBron's identity. And I'm going to say brand again, but I don't mean that in a cynical way.
He's a very athletic walking dad joke.
Yeah, he is. He is.
He loves dad jokes. He loves being corny, which sometimes can present an interesting contrast because he's also much more willing to speak about political and social issues than Michael Jordan ever did. And there was a pretty famous quote, which I'm probably going to butcher. Michael Jordan was asked about that, why he didn't speak out against this issue or that issue. And his response was, Republicans buy shoes too. And I understand it. And from a business wise, it makes a lot of sense. Also, the world of politics was very different in the 90s. The level of vitriol was different. And I don't want to say it was even particularly that much better, but it was just different. Michael Jordan was unknowable because he was protected, because he played things very close to the vest, because he wouldn't talk about a lot of things. And LeBron, it would be so much more difficult for an athlete of his caliber, and he has a desire to be a superstar and to go in different directions. So if you're going to do that, you're going to be asked a lot of hard questions, and the audience is a little too smart to accept there's just a lot of good people out there stuff. It's a challenging thing that he's going through.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess it's just I'm very sympathetic to him on that level, because like people want more authenticity from him sometimes, but then you think about any moment where he has shown like a little bit more authenticity, like how much he has been raked over the coals for that. I mean, most of us can agree that the "I'll take my talents to South Beach" thing was a mistake, in the sense that holding the press conference and making it into an event and everything, was probably in poor taste. But at the same time, the degree to which he was vilified for that and like sent death threats and like, I mean, the level of emotion about that was a lot. And I think maybe that's a little bit out of bounds. But I mean, even stuff like, he had a very minor criticism of the Chinese government in and around the Hong Kong protest stuff, and got in a ton of trouble with that. And I mean, it's just every little thing, it becomes just such a big thing when you are LeBron in this particular era. And again, Michael Jordan was very protected by the media. He also protected himself by like not speaking publicly and personally about a lot of things, but part of the mythology of Michael Jordan and him being held up as this godlike figure is that, as you're saying, he's so unknowable, and LeBron's not like that. Like, we know him, we know a persona of him, and it's just different. I have a really hard time sort of comparing them as icons in that way, because they're just from such a different era.
Well, in Jordan, it was interesting where every now and then little things would creep out and you would find out stuff about him. It's like, oh, is he a jerk?
Yeah.
And he is.
He is, yes.
Did you ever see his Michael Jordan's Hall of Fame acceptance speech?
Oh, I don't know if I have.
This man made hundreds of millions of dollars between the success he had on the court and his ability to be such an amazing spokesperson off the court. He is adored. His face was on posters in like 85% of the bedrooms of kids in America, and probably more adults than would want to admit it. Good looking guy with charisma. He hosted SNL, all this amazing stuff and all the adulation. In his Hall of Fame speech, he just spent a lot of time trashing the people who, like the high school coach who cut him.
Yeah.
He actually had the guy who was picked before him in the draft flown in to sort of like take a little shot. It's like, I think everyone agreed that they made the wrong decision when they picked you. I was like, passive aggressive, snarky. Also, you do have the question, what would any of us be like if we lived in Michael Jordan's world? Anna, if you had become a superstar basketball player, what would you have been like having your ego fed and people talking about how wonderful you are? I mean, I think you get a little cocky when I tell you how great you are just on this show. So imagine if everyone had been doing that.
You know who I'd like to think I would be? I would like to think I would be Reggie Miller, my favorite basketball player, who in his Hall of Fame accepted speech tearfully thanked his sister and just hugged her a bunch.
You want to be that person, and maybe it would be, but in fairness, Reggie Miller was also a jerk.
I think his legacy has come out a little bit better than like Jordan's in terms of like, he had the jerk thing while he was playing, and yet he seems like a pretty nice guy. I don't know. That's my outside perception, but that could just be me like wanting to believe that because he's been a big supporter of women's basketball and stuff. So like, I'm a fan of those activities of his.
No, he was an irritant on the court.
That was definitely his identity.
Did you ever watch the TV show Wonder Years?
I'm familiar with Wonder Years.
I'm going to go on a real long trip, but you come with me. You know Wayne, the irritating older brother?
Okay, yeah.
That was Reggie Miller as a basketball player. He was just that irritating brother who was always egging people on. And then John Stockton, I think, was the one who would lose his head and like headbutted him. And then Reggie Miller just was like, "Oh, what? He headbutted me? Can you believe it?" It's like, yeah, you're lucky he didn't shoot you as much of a jerk as you were being. They would interview Miller before the next game. It's like, you really are irritating. You really are antagonizing. It's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just there to play the game. It's like, oh, and he would just have this eating grin because he's having the time of his life. And it wasn't even that he was a trash talker, because Michael Jordan, Larry Bird, they were trash talkers. But they were trying to like crush your self-esteem. They would say stuff like, oh, you don't even belong on the same court as me. You're not going to get another point against me. Do you know how good I am? To undermine the confidence. Reggie Miller would go on there to just piss people off. And he did it with a smile. And I've heard that off the court, he was just a really likable, charming. He was impish. He was puck. It helps a lot of professional athletes. You need to have that because it's a psychological game. Because the NBA and all professional sports are filled with the best of the best of the best of the best. As you get older and everyone's younger and stronger and faster, part of it is you need to learn how to play well and you need to know how to get under people's skin any way that you can. He was just that irritating brother who was going to make you crazy until you took a swing at him. And all of a sudden, because you take a swing at him, you're the one kicked out of the game, and he's the one laughing and getting another free throw.
If you're a Reggie Miller fan, you end up liking that about him because it's sort of the way you identify with Reggie Miller is that he doesn't have a short guy thing. He's obviously very tall, but he's got a skinny guy thing. He doesn't have the athleticism. Like, he's not athletically gifted in the same way that Michael Jordan was athletically gifted. So he has to do other things to succeed. And then if you're a fan of his, you're like, look how he connives to succeed despite his physical limitations, which again is a projection since he is very athletic and he's 6'7". So it's not like he's not athletically gifted, but just compared to a lot of the other guys in the NBA, that wasn't his game, right? He's a shooter. He's not got the kind of all around game that Michael Jordan has. He just doesn't have that same type of athleticism. And Reggie would also say that he learned to stand up for himself in that way by being beaten up by Cheryl when he was a kid. So I don't know. Anyway, we should talk about this Space Jam movie and ask whether you actually liked it too.
Well, before you go, I remember there was an ESPN documentary about the Knicks and the Pacers and the feud there and Miller. And you saw him talking trash. And then they said, it's like, and his sister also was a wonderful player. And then camera pans was like, yeah, I was a much better player than Reggie ever was. It's like, oh my God, it's the whole family. But to answer your question about Space Jam, The New Legacy, if I liked it, no. Okay. It wasn't a good movie. It was a lot of nonsense. My kids liked it, and that means a lot.
Yeah.
Basically, I think it suffered the same fate as the first one, where it was a kids' movie. The kids are like, it doesn't work on a second level very well. And also, just like the first movie, a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff is so much more interesting. Basically, desexualizing Lola Bunny. You know, they got rid of the curves and they got rid of the belly shirt. And, of course, that was the thing with cartoons. Always had those hypersexualized, curvy female characters. But it was a different time. In the 90s, it was a different time, even before that. I mean, that story's interesting. The fact that they did this movie with LeBron is interesting. Also, they remove, and this is something that a lot of people have criticized it for. I don't know if I'm criticizing for it, but I do find it funny, where they remove Pepe Le Pew because Pepe Le Pew is a problematic character. The whole thing of him chasing after the women, trying to force himself upon them. So they're going to remove Pepe Le Pew, but then in the background of the movie, they have the nun from the movie The Devils.
Yeah. A friend mentioned that to me because I wouldn't have known that reference, but yes.
It's a pretty deep reference. Have you researched and what happens in that movie?
I know that it's like weird, but if you know better than I, you can go for it.
Because basically it's a lot of sexual intrigue in the church at the time. People are tortured. There's very strong sexual content. It's a disturbing movie. It's one that is owned by Warner Brothers. Here's a crazy thing. It's owned by Warner Brothers. Warner Brothers takes all their properties and throws them in there. And theoretically, it's like, okay, this is advertisers. Oh, great kazoo. I should watch old Flintstones and what's up. You cannot see that movie anywhere. It had a nun who was sexually obsessed with a priest because she was rejected or spurned or he loved someone else. She basically destroyed his life. He ended up being burned at the stake, or he basically was killed by the church. And the movie ended. And hey, folks, parental guidance suggested for this particular scene because this is dark. The church is burned down. The priest is charred and burned, and all that's left is his skeleton. The obsessed nun is given his leg bone and basically ends the movie using that bone to sexually satisfy herself.
Yeah, it's a lot.
That character's in the movie. Rick and Morty are in the movie. The characters from Clockwork Orange are in this movie. These are hard R movies. RoboCop's in the movie. People complain, it's like, you're going to remove Pepe Le Pew, but you're going to have the nun from that movie, or you're going to have Rick and Morty and the insanely adult content from that show. I'm not upset about it. I think they're just trying to, obviously those are background characters or cameos. Pepe Le Pew would be the main character, and also that's what they do. But Oh, they had Pennywise from It. It's a kid's movie. It's a guy who the first scene in his movie like rips a kid's arm off. It's like mixed messages all over the place. I find all that more interesting than the actual movie. The actual movie was silly and it doesn't tie together well, and the movie was too long.
It was long. I admit that whole middle part that was kind of just the animated part. That was when I was checking Twitter a lot because that was just, it felt long. Yeah, the IP stuff is fascinating because I can see that being them reaching for that second level you're talking about. I mean, those references are clearly not there for children, and yet who are they really there for? Because the references are all over the place. I don't have an answer to that question. I mean, it's weird. I will say that much about it.
It doesn't work getting into that second level because there weren't really any jokes there.
Yeah, I know. They're just incidentally present. Yeah.
It's just like, oh, Rick and Morty. Oh, the guys from Clockwork Orange. It wasn't like a real smart use of the cameo. It was just, and that's sort of the thing with all the cameos. It was just, they're all the background characters. Oh, there's Penelope Pitstop. There's the Great Gazoo. There's Fred Flintstone, whoever it is. They're watching the game. And it's like, oh, okay, yeah. I guess that's more interesting than if it was just an audience. But it's not a joke. It's not really anything other than, oh yeah, that makes for interesting listicle articles online.
Yeah. I mean, I would believe that is actually just the point of it existing. It's too predictable for me to want to talk about the Lola Bunny thing, but I probably should say a couple things about it. So, this is kind of a debate that I think has valuable points on both sides in terms of people being angry about the redesign and people feeling that the redesign was necessary. So, as someone who only watched Space Jam as an adult, Lola Bunny is ridiculously sexualized in the 1996 movie. Enough that I actually did find it offensive. She's introduced as an embodiment of a Playboy bunny, and the amount of hypersexualization is extreme, even for somebody who's used to consuming sort of male-oriented media like myself. I am definitely not against redesigning the character. And to be clear, I'm someone who studies sex and comics and stuff. I am all for sexy cartoon characters and comic book characters and all of this stuff.
You're not prudish.
I am definitely not. Come at me with your sexy cartoon characters, but there's an issue with all of that being confined to a single character who is the only female character in the entire Enterprise. And that's where we're running into trouble. And you run into trouble with stuff like that too, in terms of audience and context. Is this the right type of sexiness for this space and this moment? Oh, those are conversations you can have about some of that imagery. One of the, I think, valid critiques that people had against the redesign is that one of the main ways they change the character's body is just to basically not, so she doesn't have boobs anymore. That's a really interesting thing because she is a rabbit who would not have that physiology anyway. So it's a very strange debate to be having, but it ties in with a lot of ways that women with larger breasts are shamed for having larger breasts as though they are hypersexual, just by virtue of them having naturally larger breasts. So I can see a lot of women being annoyed by that because it feeds into some of those myths, and those myths really affect women really deeply, especially if you're somebody that hits puberty a little bit earlier, and it really affects your life in significant ways. It affects the clothes you can wear. It affects the way that you're perceived by other people. So I think that there's a lot of complicated conversations to be had there. I do think the character did need to be redesigned, though. Whether they redesigned her in the right way, I don't really have an opinion. I think that it's really complicated, and it's it's one of those things that it's really complicated, but you feel almost dumb having a complicated conversation about it because she is a very one-note character and is not sort of this character that sort of even deserves to have kind of the place in the zeitgeist that she does. And yet, she's still the only female character in this cartoon universe, and specifically had to be added to the cartoon universe because no female characters existed in that cartoon universe. I mean, essentially, I think the problem you're running into with a character like that is that if you're only going to have one female character, she has to represent all female characters, and that is never going to satisfy anybody. That is just an impossible task for any character, rabbit or human, to fulfill. Although it is interesting the way that they incorporated WNBA players into the new Space Jam, because That's something that we saw in the Uncle Drew movie as well, where they incorporated Lisa Leslie and they had the players play basketball against female basketball players, because there's been a real push in recent years to sort of integrate the branding of the NBA and the WNBA more. So I did like to see Diana Taurasi and I think it's Nneka Egumike were the two players that are in the new Space Jam movie. So I like to see them getting a little bit of a spotlight, and, not that it necessarily went anywhere, but it's definitely a change from the 1996 one to at least have other women present in roles.
They desexualized her, but they didn't give her anything else. They didn't give her anything to be interesting. So now, instead it was like a bland but curvily drawn and sexually drawn character, and now it's just like, now it doesn't even have that.
Well, she has her whole plot where she is training with Wonder Woman and everything to tie all that into the branding of female empowerment, which again is good and bad.
Then it feels very much like, okay, well, they're doing that to get interest in the Warner Brothers vault of content. I remember listening to the How Did This Get Made podcast where they talked about the Space Jam. This was a few years back.
Oh, yeah, I've listened to that one, actually.
And then they later Paul Scheer talked about all the emails they got from young gay women or young bisexual women who revealed that watching Space Jam and Lola Bunny caused a lot of them to have their sexual awakening.
Yeah.
On one hand, I get, and I've known so many people have had several queer friends who will talk about how for a lot of them sort of starting to question their sexuality or realizing that it wasn't, they may be something other than straight, started because cartoons, because a lot of times cartoon characters were drawn cute and sexy. And also you would watch it so much when you're younger. It's like, oh, okay. Not too long ago, we had an episode where one of our guests reveals, like, yeah, I just was watching Scooby-Doo and realized how much I liked Daphne and how much I was really disappointed when she wasn't on the screen. It's like, oh, wait a minute, this might mean something. And a lot of young women apparently had the same experience watching Lola Bunny.
No, for sure. And like when I criticize like sort of a sexualized portrayal of something in media, that is not like criticizing sort of the meanings that people can take from those things, because that is like the prudish way of doing sort of critique of sexuality in media, because these images are super, super complicated. And I mean, yeah, the other big one for a lot of people is Fox Robin Hood as like a super big crush, and like across the sexuality spectrum, cartoon characters, certain characters have always sort of been magnets for that. And I mean, we've talked about my fandom of Nightcrawler on the podcast before, who is a character that intersects with furry communities in various ways and stuff. So I am very respectful of the diverse sexualities that these cartoon characters can interact with, and I do think that's a positive meaning we could take away from a character like that. And even just like the insertion of sexuality into a desexualized space can be very powerful, and I think that the character is complicated on that level. But again, it's inescapable that she's the only female character in the movie and exists to be sexy, and there's the link between her being a bunny and a Playboy bunny. And I think you could even argue that it sort of reduces some of the kind of gender and sexual complications of Bugs Bunny by offloading that onto a female character. But I mean, again, these are actually really complicated questions having to do with what good, quote unquote, good representation should look like. I'm always of the standpoint that good representation has to look like more diverse representation, and having more female characters in spaces is like usually the way to go about it. Because I mean, one way to make that kind of like pretty much completely okay is that you have multiple female characters. One of them is super sexy, and that's like part of her identity, and others are other ways of being female in this world, and that's like completely like the way that you can do that in a better way, I would argue.
Neither of us like this movie, but we do find parts of it. We do find its existence interesting. I couldn't believe there was no Michael Jordan, the basketball player cameo.
Oh God, no, that did not surprise me, but yeah.
Well, apparently they've been trying to get him to do another movie. They even were getting financing for Space Jam 2, and he kept saying, I'm not going to do it. He didn't like it. They kept thinking they were going to be able to convince him, and they just weren't, because he did not want to do it, and it's Michael Jordan. You can't make Michael Jordan do anything that he doesn't want to, and you're not going to be able to like throw enough dollar signs at him because he has 2/3 of all printed money. But you figure it's like, well, it's been 20 years, or they can get him to show up for one scene, or him laughing in the background of the audience. That'd be cool. They didn't get him, but they got Michael B. Jordan. How did they get Michael B. Jordan? And it must be a thing of he just wants to do something for, and I don't know his life at all. I don't know if he has kids, or he has a niece or nephew, or if he grew up loving the first movie, or I would love to know the background of how you got the reigning sexiest man alive and a legit A-list star. How they got him to do that scene and basically making fun of his own name, and it was like, and it seemed like sort of an ego-free cameo where he was a little bit the butt of the joke. I was like, that was one of the funnier parts of the movie.
Yeah, I've heard that cameo. Among the people I've discussed the movie with, that cameo has been getting good play.
Michael B. Jordan is an interesting persona because nothing seems to affect him or hurt him, because he has been in some garbage movies and he has done some weird cameos, and he always comes out with just this like really likable smile, and he's like, yeah. Fantastic Four wrecked careers, but not his. Miles Teller is still trying to like shake the stink off from that, and Josh Trank, the director of that, he hasn't done his blank check to make whatever movie he wanted, got cash for that. Now, one thing I want to talk with you real quick, because you were a basketball fan growing up. It seems like basketball players get more of a chance to break through to other media more than anyone else. I mean, have you noticed that? Or does that theory hold water with you?
To a certain extent. I won't. Okay, well, the thing I'll say about it is that there's a number of factors sort of contributing to that. The blackness of basketball is a big thing in terms of the way that NBA players are marketed. You really can't get around that. Like, it's like essential to the identity of the league, and it's essential to the identity of the sport, particularly, I would say, in the Michael Jordan and after era. People think about him as a very establishment figure, but back in the 80s, he was considered a very kind of rebellious figure who was more associated sort of with hip hop culture. And then as he became this more establishment figure that selling sneakers to Republicans and stuff too throughout the 90s, that identity kind of faded away a little bit and his image got more tightly controlled. But yeah, so I don't think you can separate it from questions of race and the way that race is marketable in different eras. I think also that the nature of basketball as a sport that lends itself to kind of, it lends itself to personal mythologizing to the extent that part of the culture of basketball, which is, related to a lot of other facets of Black culture too. It is related to hip hop culture. It's related to dance culture. And the way that street ball came into at the NBA, like in the 21st century with players like Iverson, sort of some of the styles that were sort of, I don't want to say just about personal glorification, but there is an element of just looking spectacular while you're playing basketball. That is part of the game of basketball. It's certainly part of Steph Curry's game, and it's certainly part of why he's so popular in our present moment. There's like a celebritization within the sport of basketball that can lend itself to kind of these beyond basketball things. And I'm not answering this question very well.
Basketball allows for a lot of showboating. You have the slam dunk contest. Yeah. I'm trying to think of football players that were given a chance at that sort of celebrity. Joe Theismann did a movie. Not Randy Moss. Howie Long got to star in one little B movie. And he also got to be John Travolta's third in command in Broken Arrow. But other than that, they never gave any football player, and certainly never a baseball player, the run of movies that Shaquille O'Neal had. Shaquille O'Neal starred or had a major role in like 3 or 4 movies. That's astounding.
The good and bad of it, though, that I would say, and it kind of relates to the relationship between Bugs Bunny and Michael Jordan, is that there is, and again, this is really complicated, and I'm not saying it's good or bad because there's empowering and disempowering aspects of this, but sort of the use of NBA bodies as spectacle, relating that to, Michael Jordan is famous because he's as famous as Bugs Bunny, and, what does that mean in terms of the ways that we're marketing sort of his identity and like tied in with race and Shaquille O'Neal's brand, it's partly to do with the spectacle of his body, of him being this very large, jovial black man. And that's not negative because he's creating that persona and he's has agency and is involved with it and stuff. But in terms of people's willingness to buy that, there's a lot of complicated things bound up in that. And I do think that that's part of when you see basketball players marketed. I mean, it's changed in like the player empowerment era in the last 10 years as players have gotten to have more control over their images. But even in recent memory, you can think of something like the LeBron James Vanity Fair cover. I don't know if you remember that, but they did kind of like a King Kong pose with LeBron on the cover. I think that there was something where he was actually the first black man who'd been centrally featured on the cover of Vanity Fair too, which is outrageous because this is not like a long time ago. This was like 8 years ago. So they did a cover with him and Gisele Bundchen in a King Kong pose on the cover. And it created a lot of controversy, but at the same time, still complicated. LeBron agreed to do this. He wasn't being manipulated or anything.
And they didn't put him in a monkey. I'm looking at the image right there, and you can see where it was inspired. Giselle wearing the similar dress that Fay Ray wore in the movie. Thank God. And somebody suggested he wear a monkey suit.
Yeah, who knows, right? But so that's an example, though, of how complicated it is, sort of the selling of these athletes is because it gets bound up in a lot of racist tropes, and it is really hard to navigate that because that is a way that the players are benefiting from some of those tropes, and like you can like regain ownership over some of those tropes, right? I mean, that's a common way that you fight back when you're a disempowered person to kind of own the things that are disempowering you, and yet it's complicated. I'll say that at the very least.
Well, you hear it all the time when people talk about the specific minority using the slur that is used against them inside of their own relationships, and people are like, well, why would you use that word when it's so hate-filled? And it's like to take ownership of the word, to make it their own. You could understand LeBron trying to turn those tropes or those stereotypes in on itself. It's tough, and I don't have the near the expertise to give like a real educated thing. I know whenever I see it, I'm like, oh, okay, and then I look for people smarter than me to give much better discussions on it because it's complicated.
It is. And I mean, again, I don't like prescribing what anybody should do when I'm talking about these things as a white lady. But I mean, I will say just one other thing. Like, I mean, in terms of the way different players are marketing themselves, a lot of it's really bound up in the NBA dress code and some of the ways that the players were sort of prohibited from basically expressing blackness in the wake of Allen Iverson in particular, and in the wake of the riot in Detroit. What is that stupid riot called? The
Rodney King or the
No, the Detroit Pistons, Indiana Pacers one.
Oh, the Malice in the Palace.
Malice in the Palace, yeah. In the wake of that, you had them instituting this dress code, right? That banned a lot of staples of hip hop fashion, like chains and stuff, right? And so, like, you had to, and it banned chains and jerseys, it banned sweatpants, it banned athletic shoes. You had to show up looking like a middle manager to games, basically, right? And that policy is technically still in place, but you had people like Russell Westbrook getting around it by, okay, well, if I have to wear a button-down shirt and a suit, I'm going to wear a crazy pattern button-down suit and like wild glasses, and this is how I'm going to get around that. Obviously, it's completely fallen by the wayside now, I would say, particularly during the pandemic, because you had like sort of the bubble games and stuff, and players couldn't show up in suits during that. So, I mean, it's like almost completely fallen apart for both players and coaches. But still, the ways that the league has sort of controlled athletes' abilities to self-brand themselves is fascinating and complicated, but it's also fascinating and complicated the way the players have rebelled against that, found ways to get around it, and have gotten so powerful in part through the different outlets that they have through social media and different aspects of branding that they can have. I mean, a player like Russell Westbrook, like he has branding with so many different companies and not necessarily conventional sports companies. You know, he's got like a jewelry line, and like he's got like had a line at Barney's and stuff. Like he's really involved in fashion, and really involved in fashion in interesting ways too. You know, his clothing line was like gender neutral and all of this stuff, right? Which is like, I couldn't sort of imagine sort of a player branding themselves that way 20 years ago. So I don't know. I think that there's a lot of empowering things that are going on for like a lot of these athletes in our present moment. I don't know that all of that is captured by the Space Jam film, but it is definitely part of the intertext of this film, and especially in terms of LeBron James being such an icon of this player empowerment era. So I think the film will remain interesting on that level. Still not a good movie though.
LeBron did Trainwreck, and then he does this, and he is somebody who very much embraces being more than quote unquote just a basketball player. He wants to be an iconic figure. What do you think's next? Do you think he's going to try to do more in entertainment? He seems like a guy who would be perfectly fit for, once he's retired, hosting Jeopardy or some late night game show or something like that. He's not an actor per se. He's a personality, and sometimes personalities do very good on the talk show circuit, ignoring the Magic Johnson talk show, because that was an abomination. Do you think there is a course for him to continue in pop culture outside of being an amazing athlete and being someone who has on occasion spoken thoughtfully on social issues?
If I'm going to make a prediction, I do not think his future will be in front of the camera. I think it will be as an owner of sports teams and an owner of production companies, both of which he's not a majority owner in any sports teams currently, but I imagine he will be in the future. And I mean, he already has his production company that is specifically set up to promote Black artists and producers and stuff. So I think that that's where you're going to see his influence. I don't know whether he'll be involved in the NBA or whether he'll be involved in the wider entertainment industry, but I think that's where, because that's another way that we can rethink it too. It was so great that Michael Jordan got to star in Space Jam alongside Bugs Bunny, but LeBron's going to be producing the movie, right? Rather than starring in it. And I think that's what you're going to see for him in the future.
Well, there's an interesting path there, because Kobe Bryant, I want to say the year before he passed away, won an Oscar for, I believe it was a short film that he produced. And there he was on the stage accepting his Oscar. And it was real interesting. Kobe Bryant, a complicated figure. They've been talking about doing another Space Jam movie for years and years and years and years. And I believe there even had been rumors, and who knows how close it ever got to fruition, of him starring in the next, of him being the star of the new one. He was never as likable a personality, and then his legacy became very complicated by the sexual assault accusations. If you're a smart guy with personality and charisma and a level of fame, there's a place for you in the entertainment field just as a producer, because people want to meet LeBron James, and rich people meet LeBron James, they might write a check to get something produced. So I'd be interested to see that.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that he's doing something that is both socially conscious and really smart in terms of promoting other Black creators to create content, not just aimed at Black audiences, but certainly including Black audiences. And I think that that's both a smart social decision and a smart business decision, to be honest.
Anna, do you have a favorite performance by an athlete in a movie?
Oh gosh. You know what's I don't what's horrible.
This is such a tough question that I'm throwing completely out of nowhere, and this is how difficult it is. I throw it at you. I knew I was going to ask this, and I don't have an answer for it, which is completely unfair. I remember watching Blue Chips, starring Nick Nolte, where he was playing a college basketball coach. It was Shaquille O'Neal when he was only 2-3 years into his career, and it was a nice performance by him. He was just playing Shaquille O'Neal. Shaquille O'Neal has a really good charisma. He's just a tree trunk of a human being, and it was tough to cast him in movies. honestly, the Genie movie was the closest thing they could have done to make it work, but it was just a lousy movie. But the idea was like, if it had been done well, that could have worked, because you're not really going to buy him in Steel as a super scientist who battles crime. It's like, what? So, that's when I would say Blue Chip with Shaquille O'Neal, where he got to take full advantage of his abilities, and it was really fun.
Well, I mean, I am a defender of the Uncle Drew movie, which was a movie that I was really clowning on existing. And yet, I will say that the thing that I think is joyful about that movie that's a little bit missing from Space Jam New Legacy, which, both of these movies are extensions of commercials. So they're very similar. And yet the Uncle Drew movie, you have the players kind of in the old age makeup getting to clown around as themselves and kind of throw themselves into these very corny roles. I think it's a joyful movie to the extent that they seem like they're having so much fun. Whereas in Space Jam: A New Legacy, you only have most of the players just present as, CGI avatars, and they're not really there, right? Like, we don't even get the kind of fun cameo stuff that you were talking about from the original movie, right? Where they're in the hospital and stuff and running into doorways and stuff. You can tell I think, watching those scenes from the old Space Jam that they were having a heck of a lot of fun doing that too. So I'm gonna go with my beloved Reggie Miller in the Uncle Drew movie, and specifically, so his character in the Uncle Drew movie is that he's this sharpshooter who's lost his eyesight, and that's like the gag. And then there's this point toward the end of the movie where they have to win the big game, and they get him this pair of special glasses that just like fix his eyesight. And it makes no sense. Like, it's just like, hey, we invented magic glasses, you can see now. And he picks up the glasses and he just like puts all of himself into this, like, I can see. And I think about that randomly and just get this hugest smile on my face, because it is so goofy and he seems like he was having so much fun and completely leaning into the fact that he in no ways is any type of actor. So yeah, that's my pick.
And the thing about Uncle Drew as opposed to Space Jam, where Uncle Drew was a modestly budgeted movie, it definitely was shooting for a smaller audience. It did seem like they were all having fun. It had a lot of basketball players on that movie, and you could tell that they enjoyed being around each other, and they must have had just amazing pickup basketball games in between scenes. Starred Kyrie Irving, and I actually have, here's the thing, and I'm not 100% sure. I might cut this when the episode goes live, but I do want to share this with you. I worked at, every now and then they would bring in athletes, try to convince them to sign with the company. Kyrie Irving actually came in and they were trying to get him to sign with them instead of Nike. So they made an announcement. It's like, okay, everybody, at 2:00, we're going to give out T-shirts with Kyrie's face on it, and wear that T-shirt, and we're going to have banners and everything, and we're all going to cheer, Kyrie, 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 when he comes in, and we're going to cheer like crazy, and we're going to have a big announcement. We're going to have music playing, and we're going to have Baltimore Ravens cheerleaders shaking their pom-poms, and we're going to do this, and he's going to love it. So we came in, and we were all cheering. I'm like, why am I here? Because I'm not even particularly a big basketball fan. But it's like, well, beats working. So we're all cheering, and he walks into the room, and like a couple of sparklers and confetti threw in the air. He looked sort of freaked out. A week later, it announced that he signed with Nike because they offered him $20 million. I was like, oh, it turns out all the T-shirts with his face on it and confetti does not equal $20 million. I had the shirt for a while because they never could sell the shirt because they didn't have the right to use his likeness because he was a Nike athlete. So you could just see all these employees working out in the gym that they had wearing Kyrie shirts because they could.
Well, I mean, I'll say my piece of support for the player empowerment era, where it's like Kyrie's worked hard to have the skills that he does and have the brand that he does, and he's got the right to take his talents where he wants to take them.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that really helps these players is they can make so much money with the endorsements, with the shoe deals. And, Michael Jordan, basically every part of his body, whatever he wears on it, there's a deal. And that gives them more power because they're not as beholden to the NBA or to the team, where if they don't offer them the money, they can hold out longer. And they can also make very good money playing overseas. There have been some very good NBA players maybe all-star or one step below all-star, and they decided that they weren't happy with the deal they were getting in the States, so they just played in Spain or wherever and got treated like kings. They got to be the best player in the league instead of somebody who was sort of on the team.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we can lose sight of the fact, we think about just the super successful players in the NBA who do just have enormous amounts of money. But I mean, it's a cruel, cruel league. I mean, there's stats like the average career of an NBA player is like 2 years. And I mean, all of the people that don't make it, there are so few spots in the league. So, the people that get to the top, yeah, they make a lot of money, but it's not like this is something that's just being handed to people. I mean, the amount of hard work and luck and circumstance to get you to that position, it's not like there's that many people in that position,
I have worked out in the same gym as professional athletes. I'm not talking stars. I'm just talking about people who have spent some time in the NFL or NBA. They are superhuman. I'm in okay shape, and at the time I was in like as close to good shape as I was ever going to get, and I'm like lifting that 20-pound dumbbell and breaking a sweat, and there's a guy with like 50 pounds of chains wrapped around his torso doing his 18th pull-up. I was like, I don't even feel like I'm the same species as this guy. That is astounding. The wear and tear they put on their body, how bad a shape they're in by the time they retire. People retiring after, you're right, 2 or 3 years, the average career for a lot of these players. Not getting paid, live off it for the rest of your life money, and also perhaps having knee or elbow or whatever. If you start playing when you're a child and the way you get beat up, you're not going to feel the same as other people your age when you retire at 25.
This is true. Capitalism is evil, right? And like, that's a thing. But at the same time, if you're going to be mad at sort of basketball players for making the amount of money that they do, it's like, well, if they weren't making the money, the majority white owners would be making the money. So I'm good if the money is there for it to go where it should go, which is to the players.
Anna, as always, this has been an amazing conversation. You're one of my favorites. I would have you on every week if I could convince you to do so, and I could have something for you. And it's always amazing. I need you to plug your pluggables.
Well, I mean, I've written something about Russell Westbrook, which people can find with the Fashion Studies Journal. It was the first thing I wrote after my PhD. I had been writing about superhero comics for ages, and I was like, I want to write something about Russell Westbrook, so I did. And I still really love that piece. It's from a few years ago. It's called Whys and Why Nots, The Stakes and Meanings of Russell Westbrook's NBA-Style Revolution. Most of my work, though, is on superheroes and comics. My book is Super Sex, Sexuality, Fantasy, and the Superhero, and I am on a couple of podcasts. I am on 3-Panel Contrast, which is a monthly discussion of comics classics selected by the podcast hosts, and I have my nerdiest thing is a weekly podcast about the classic Marvel series Excalibur, which is an UK X-Men team, and it's a weekly podcast, so every week we do another issue of the series. Brad was the very first guest on the podcast when it launched, and you will always have that iconic title.
I brag about that all the time.
So yeah, I mean, that's great because the first episodes, they get the most listens because they just keep going up and up and up over time. But yep, that's called the Oh Gosh, Oh Golly, Oh Wow podcast, available on all of your major podcast providers. And you can find me on Twitter, Peppard_Anna.
I would recommend everyone check it out. And it's always amazing to have you on. We're going to do this again soon. There's no escape for you because we love having you on, and we're going to do it again soon.
Anytime, Brad. Thanks for having me.
That wraps episode 246. Big thanks to Dr. Anna Peppard. She is one of my favorites. Looking forward to her return. Next time on the Cosmic Geppetto podcast, Ray Esposito and Kyle Crane are finally together to talk Ghostbusters Afterlife. Till then, in the words of Jar Farden,
see you in the funny pages.
Subscribe to the Cosmic Geppetto podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever quality podcasts can be found. Rate and review us while there. Follow us on Twitter at CosmicGPod, and we will follow you back. Unless you're a jerk. We don't follow jerks. Like us on Facebook at facebook.com/Cosmic Geppetto. We love hearing your ideas for upcoming episodes. Email us at cosmicgeppetto@comcast.net.
Sean Bradley. You remember Sean Bradley?